Let's talk about the halfway point in fraction numbers. This fraction is obviously the fraction 1/2. The thing you should notice about this fraction is that the top is exactly half of the bottom. Half of 2 is 1. Now what about this number, 8/16?
That number can be reduced to 1/2.
Yes, and let me point out something special about this fraction. Just like the fraction 1/2, where the top was exactly half of the bottom, if you look at this fraction, 8/16, the top is exactly half of the bottom. Half of 16 is 8. Remember that the bottom of a fraction tells you how many equal pieces an object was cut into, and the top tells you how many of those pieces you're talking about. Here something was cut into 16 equal pieces, and we're talking about 8 of them. And 8 pieces is exactly half of 16 pieces. These fractions are also some examples of 1/2. 4/8, 10/20, 3/6, and 7/14, because you'll notice that all the tops of these fractions are exactly half of the value of the bottoms.
That's pretty interesting, Mr. C.
That always works as long as the bottom of your fraction is an even number. Odd numbers are a little different, and we'll look at the halfway marks for some odd numbers in a moment. But first let me ask you a question. If I have fractional parts that are in tenths, what would the halfway mark be?
Well, half of 10 would be 5, so the halfway point in tenths would be 5, or 5/10.
Yes, let me list out all the fractional parts of tenths between 0 and 1. It's easy to see that all of these fractional parts are less than 1/2, because the tops of these fractions are all less than the midpoint 5. And all of these fractional parts are greater than 1/2 because the tops of these are all larger than the midpoint 5. Now what if our fractional parts were in sixths? Where would the midpoint be here?
Well, half of 6 is 3, so the midpoint is 3/6.
That's right. And again, all of these fractional numbers are less than 1/2 because the tops of these fractions are less than 3. And all of these fractional numbers are greater than 1/2 because the tops of these fractions are greater than the midpoint 3. Now what if you had odd number fractional denominators? Here are some midpoints for some odd numbers. Now what if our fractions were in sevenths? Where would the midpoint be?
Half of 7 is 3.5, so the halfway point is 3.5 over 7.
That's right. And all of these fraction numbers would be less than 1/2. And all of these fraction numbers would be greater than 1/2. What if we had fractions in fifths? Where would the halfway point be there?
Half of 5 is 2.5, so the halfway mark in fifths is 2.5 over 5.
That's correct. And these fraction numbers will be less than 1/2 since all the tops of these fractions are all less than 2.5. And all of these fractions are greater than 1/2 since all of these fraction numerators are all greater than 2.5. Okay, now let's see if you can identify when a fraction is less than 1/2, equal to 1/2, or greater than 1/2. Is this fraction greater than, equal to, or less than 1/2? And explain why.
It's less than 1/2 because the halfway mark in eighths is 4, and 3 is smaller than 4.
Correct. How about this fraction, Bruno?
Well, the halfway point in twelfths is 6, and 7 is more than 6, so 7/12 is larger than 1/2.
Very good. Is 4/9 bigger or smaller than 1/2, Irving?
The halfway mark in ninths is 4.5, and 4 is less than 4.5, so 4/9 is less than 1/2.
That's correct. Bruno, do 3/5. The halfway point in fifths is 2.5 over 5. And 3 is larger than 2.5, so 3/5 is larger than 1/2. Yes, now let's see if we can round some mixed numbers to the nearest whole number.